All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Ashley Weissmuller, and I am the Pizza and Politics Coordinator at the Dole Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us for our first virtual Pizza and Politics. Before we get started, I want to give a special thank you to Senator Nancy Kassebaum, who asked that her 2016 Dole Leadership Prize be used to support student programs. So thank you to her and for her generosity. I'm joined today by two guests, Professor Patrick Miller and Dave Helling. Patrick Miller is an associate professor of political science at KU with expertise in public opinion, electoral behavior, and political psychology, to name a few. And Mr. Helling is an editor and political and government reporter at the Kansas City Star. So thank you to both of you for joining me today. I know when we originally scheduled our program in March, we were going to talk about Super Tuesday, but I just appreciate your willingness and your cooperation throughout this time to still be able to help. So thank you both. So why don't we get started? If you both would just sort of briefly introduce yourselves a little bit more, maybe tell us a little bit about your upbringing, education, and then what you're currently working on if you have any special projects. So
I yield the floor to Dr. Miller.
Upbringing, complicated. I pay someone to listen to you complain about that. That's a bad joke. That's a bad joke. Well, I'm from Virginia originally. Grew up there, went to college at William and Mary, lived in Georgia after college, went to UNC Chapel Hill where I got my PhD, strangely did a postdoc at Duke. Nobody judges me for that. Went to Cincinnati for 2 years, and now I'm in Kansas at KU. And as you said, I study mostly political behavior topics from a quantitative perspective. So I do a lot of surveys, experiments, statistics. What am I working on these days? A lot related to partisanship, a lot related to attitudes towards transgender rights, which is an interesting area, not a lot of research on that. And a couple other random things here and there. Keeps me busy.
Dave Helling, I work for the Kansas City Star newspaper. I'm actually on the editorial board after being the chief political reporter at the Star for several years. I've been at the paper now for about 15 years. I began my career in the late 70s in television news and covered politics for TV for many, many years. I actually grew up in Kansas and went to Shawnee Mission West High School, where I graduated many, many, many years ago. And of course, always have had a deep interest in politics. I was a Dole Fellow in 2014, and we're obviously paying close attention to the 2020 elections in our little corner of the world. Although, and I think we may want to talk about this, the ability of the voters to focus on the candidacies in both parties is extraordinarily challenging now. We're about 105 days away from the primary, not just in Kansas, but in Missouri, and getting anyone to pay any attention to the campaigns has been very, very difficult because of the ongoing coronavirus crisis. So we'll pick up that again soon, but the nature of campaigning, I think Dr. Miller will probably agree with this, the nature of campaigning will be so unique this year that some of the judgments we reach about how candidates are talking to voters and stuff are going to be quite difficult to reach and problematic. We just won't know for sure whether anything is working because of the different way people are living now. So we can talk about that.
Perfect. So do you think, let's jump right in. Do you think that the COVID-19 pandemic altered the Democratic primary given Bernie Sanders' decision to drop out of the race?
Well, I'll go first, Patrick. I don't think so. I think that, and we would have probably talked about this if we had done Pizza and Politics before Super Tuesday, but it was pretty clear going into South Carolina that Bernie Sanders was the favorite in the Democratic primary, but that there was a path for a non-Bernie. Now, we weren't sure who that was going to be. Would it be Joe Biden? Would it be Amy Klobuchar? Would it be some other candidate with Pete Buttigieg? We just didn't know, but there was going to be a Bernie and a not Bernie, and that would be the dynamic after South Carolina. Well, the vice president, former vice president, did so well after South Carolina, and then the Super Tuesday contests were so quick after South Carolina that in essence it was over. And I don't think coronavirus played much of a role in that decision-making process at all.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. You know, even before the last few primaries that we had, it was pretty clear that Biden was going to be the nominee. It was very clear on Super Tuesday after that he was going to be the nominee, just given the sheer number of delegates that Sanders would have needed to have accrued after that. I mean, he would have needed the race to do a dramatic 180 degrees and for voter coalitions to substantially change. You know, I think that the early part of this contest was very much shaped by what states you had going first. I mean, you had a caucus state, and caucuses do tend to be better for Sanders, although Buttigieg arguably won that. New Hampshire, which was right in his backyard, shares a media market with Vermont. And then Nevada, which even though it's a relatively diverse state, almost 70% of caucus goers are white, skewing younger, which is Bernie's demographic. So South Carolina came along, which was the first contest that was really quite racially diverse, a majority African-American population, and put Sanders up really against a demographic that bluntly he didn't have a lot of appeal in. Sanders was not particularly appealing to African-American voters. In fact, there were a lot of limits. You know, Sanders was very much a candidate of younger whites, to a smaller degree, younger Latinos, and he had a big problem courting minority Democrats and older Democrats. And when you shifted over to contests where those voters were going to be participating in much larger numbers, it really became a contest that didn't favor Sanders anymore, as long as the field could coalesce, as Dave said. And it did. I mean, Democrats circled their wagon from the candidates down to the voters, circled around Joe Biden, and he's going to be the nominee.
Yeah, and I would just add to that briefly, you know, when the field is, and this is typically true in most elections, when a field is big in a primary setting, that is all members of one party voting rather than the general public, when you have a big field, that tends to help. I don't want to call Bernie a fringe candidate, but it does help sort of the more ideological people who have a solid base, which Bernie Sanders, of course, did in large part because of what happened in 2016. So he was always going to do well when there were 8 or 9 or 10 candidates. But after South Carolina, when Buttigieg got out so quickly, and Klobuchar a little bit after that, and the other potential alternatives, and it was just a Joe Biden versus Bernie Sanders election, then, you know, Bernie was still getting his 20%, but, or 25 or 30 or whatever it was, Senator Sanders. But, you know, at that point, it's a 2-person race, and Joe Biden is getting 60% or whatever. And so when that dynamic became obvious, then I think it was over. And I don't think COVID-19 played any role in that at all. I do think there was, and again, Dr. Miller, you may disagree with this, but I do think there's the overwhelming sentiment among the Democrats I've talked with nationally is anybody but Trump. And they wanted to coalesce around somebody who was not Donald Trump. They think Joe Biden is more electable than Bernie Sanders, and that's the dynamic that played out.
I do agree with that. So one thing, you know, what's interesting to me, you know, having studied primaries even before I was born, well, that occurred before I was born. I didn't study them before I was born. That's possible. That's the correct English here. I don't think we've really ever seen something like what happened this year happen, in the sense that the party, and I say the party collectively, lined up so quickly. What really shocked me in all of that was how quickly, not, you know, the candidates and elected officials, but how quickly the voters lined up behind Biden. You know, I mean, if you exist on Twitter, Twitter is a very contentious and polarizing place that also doesn't really reflect reality in many ways. Most Americans, most primary voters are not on Twitter. If you surveyed Democrats before this, they liked most of the candidates running, even people like Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar, who, according to Twitter, were the devil incarnate much of the time. Like, most Democrats in surveys liked both of them and would have been fine with them as a nominee. And so the typical voter who isn't tweeting about this election would have been happy with most anyone, would have lined up. But it seemed that there was never, for most candidates, it was never that moment where any candidate, particularly a candidate who wasn't Bernie Sanders, had this moment where they really just sold themselves and took off.
But don't you think, Dr. Miller, part of that is because Democrats saw all the candidates with an electability flaw, like just on the politics of it. Pete Buttigieg, he's too young. Some people were worried about his sexual preference as an electability argument, not on the merits, but just on electability. Kamala Harris, African-American woman. Amy Klobuchar, a woman. I mean, I really got the sense Democrats said, we cannot gamble with our nominee. And Joe Biden is a flawed candidate too. Let's face it, he's got problems with his son, and his abilities on the stump have eroded without question. But people saw that as the safest choice rather quickly.
I would agree. I mean, even Bernie Sanders would have had.
Right.
You're never going to find an unflawed candidate. And I think it was very clear in the polling that what Democrats wanted most was they wanted a candidate who could beat Trump. Electability was very important. But I do agree, right? I mean, I think the rhetoric around the primary was one where flaws were highlighted. Every flaw seemed like it was fatal, and then which kind of maybe kept voters from settling. And then on top of that, you never had any one candidate, I would say, whose positive appeal was so strong that they could really seal the deal.
Right.
And I think, eventually Democrats coalesced and we are where we are. But I think also, back to your original question, I think COVID-19 had nothing to do with that. I did ignore answering that.
No worries.
Yeah. But, here we are.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That was a lot, and I appreciated all of your expansions there. So how will coronavirus, surely it will change how we vote in November. What does that mean for the general election? How does the American public, proceed with a general election that could be vote by mail or something like that? How does COVID-19 change the way we vote in November and in the future?
Well, logistically, that's going to vary by state. Some states will assuredly move over to an all-mail election. We are not going to do that in Kansas. It's questionable, actually, whether it's legally allowed in Kansas or whether the Secretary of State could invoke an emergency clause to actually do it. There is some debate about that, but in Kansas, I would not expect that we're going to have an all-mail election. You can have a mail ballot, and you can vote early. So I think the state by state will be very interesting, and also what voters do will be very interesting. I mean, if the couple of contests that we had for primaries after COVID-19 say anything, it's that we should expect probably some mild decrease in turnout. How big, who knows? I wouldn't say that that's going to benefit any party in any particular way. And traditionally, vote by mail does not tend to benefit one party or the other. And we can point to cases where sometimes the Democrats won vote by mail or the Republican has. It's not clear that that's going to have any systematic benefit at the state level either. So I think there's a lot to be determined with that.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I think each state, you will see lots of battles over how people vote, and lots of court cases, and people will be, suing secretaries of state and election boards all over the country, assuming that the coronavirus remains a huge issue in the fall. I think that's likely, and there will be complaints about the process. But by and large, people are just. I disagree a little bit with Dr. Miller. I think turnout in the primaries was very high. I think there may be more interest, and the turnout may not be as depressed as you might expect in this situation. There'll be some problems, but by and large, I think the interest in the November election is off the charts. I do think the biggest impact of coronavirus will be on campaigns and campaigning. For example, I think it's likely that both political conventions will be canceled. I think the Democrats have actually already said they're going to do something virtually, or they're certainly thinking about it. The Republicans are still talking about gathering in one place, but boy, it's hard to see how you can say no to college football, but yes to 30,000 people in an arena for what really is a coronation anymore. So I think conventions are under enormous scrutiny. I think rallies are going to be tough. I think so. You'll see much more virtual campaigning, much more social media. Whether TV advertising remains important or not it's not clear. So I think, the way that the candidates, not only by the way at the presidential level, but at all levels, interface with the electorate is going to undergo enormous changes that, guys like Dr. Miller will be studying for decades, to try and understand exactly what impact all of this had on voter behavior. But I've said all along, and I still believe this to be a case, all elections that involve an incumbent at some level are a referendum on that incumbent. You either want Donald Trump for 4 more years or you don't. I think that is just, orders of magnitude bigger now. He'll be judged on the state of the economy in November, on the state of the coronavirus, on his performance in office. And I do think that turnout will be high on that basis.
Yeah, I don't disagree that turnout will still be high. I would not be surprised, all things equal, if maybe we saw turnout be a little lower, a little higher. I wouldn't expect any huge drop in turnout based on what we've seen. But I think certainly there'll be some segment of voters out there who, maybe particularly older voters, who might not come out, but to be determined what size. I do agree that there'll be a really big impact on how campaigns are run, although I think that's going to be more as you go down the ballot. I think the biggest impact will be on things, for example, like campaigns for the Kansas legislature, where typically you're running in a small district where it doesn't make any sense to go on TV, and where you're typically raising, $20, $50, $75,000. Your TV is out of your reach. Oftentimes radio is out of your reach. And those are campaigns that are a lot more door-to-door focused. And if that kind of campaigning can't be done, in state legislative races around the country, this is the last set of state legislative elections before redistricting. So it's very critical nationally. Or here in Kansas, right? I mean, the ability to sustain a veto for the governor is effectively on the ballot, even if Republican majorities are not really threatened in our legislature. I think that's where the biggest impact will be, because the presidential race, Senate and House races, certainly there'll be some of the ground game that will be lost, perhaps, if we're still in this. But those campaigns are so TV focused anyway that I think that's really where less of the impact's going to be.
I just quickly, I would also add that if you are to see a decline in turnout or a lack of enthusiasm, I think that's much more likely in August in the primary than in the general. And I think Kansas will be a good test of that, because the Republican Senate primary is getting a lot of attention from reporters and from the academics, but you don't get a sense in the current crisis that people are really focused at all on that election. And we're 3 months out, and 3 months and change. And, if we went outside today, I live in Lenexa, if we walked outside and said, hey, who are the candidates for the Senate on the Republican side? Most people might be able to mention Chris Kobach, but they don't know Roger Marshall. They don't know Susan Wagle. And so the enthusiasm, the sort of groundswell that you might want in a primary may not be there because of coronavirus.
So do you think the media on both the right and the left side have impacted the way the public has perceived the COVID-19 pandemic?
Dr. Miller?
Oh boy. How long do you want? This is a short.
As long as you want.
Well, I am famous for saying that MSNBC and Fox News do more harm to American democracy than they help it. I'm on the record saying that to my students. I think that what we have seen with partisan media, and I would even go beyond MSNBC and Fox. I mean, if you look at the bases of both parties, they're increasingly turning to alternative online media, podcasts and blogs and so forth. So even beyond the big national news networks that we're thinking about, I think even before COVID-19, and COVID-19 to me is just another good example of this kind of left and right media and the attacks on the mainstream media have really just facilitated this reality where the left and the right increasingly live in two very different realities with very different facts and very different understandings of basic facts. And I think that the degree to which we have been able to segregate our media into media that we know is not going to challenge us also reinforces how quickly we line up behind a left and a right narrative. I think you could see that very quickly in national polling with COVID-19 on how Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives and so on, their perceptions of what was factual, what was reality would change very quickly based on what party leaders were saying or based on the narratives we saw coming out of left or right media. So yes, I mean, I do think it has had a huge impact. It has had a huge impact for 20 years. And I think it is an impact that is often more harmful than good.
Our own experience at the Star, early in the crisis, I would say mid-March, when the NBA canceled its season and the NCAA tournament was canceled, and that really focused the public's attention on the disease, and our readership went through the roof. I mean, people, we were doubling, tripling, quadrupling our normal readership, but it wasn't really about politics at all. People wanted immediate information. Is my family safe? Do I have it? Can I get a test? What happens to people when they do get it? I mean, it was very focused on information. Will my daycare center close? Can I work from home? I mean, all those sort of practical realities, newspapers particularly, but TV stations too, responded to that. And you saw there was unanimity in that. It wasn't really a political thing one way or the other. Everyone wanted to know, am I safe? But, and this is the most predictable thing in the history of the world, as the crisis has gone on, then the vast majority of folks sort of figure out how to deal with it and they're fine. And then the left and the right just go to war, not about the coronavirus, but about the implications of it. And suddenly decisions about opening or closing your state become partisan political decisions, not safety decisions, or, it's suddenly every statement you make becomes a political statement, at least in terms of governors and mayors and presidents and senators. And that was just so predictable. I mean, because we've never, in the modern world, never attempted to do what we're now attempting to do, which is to, in essence, self-quarantine for a certain amount of time to kill, to fight a deadly disease. And people, they're happy with that for a week, 2 weeks, but after about 2.5, 3 weeks, okay, now can we go back to our old life? And when that happens, then you do get the politics of it. And so I think now we're right in the maelstrom of that. I mean, you can't watch Fox or MSNBC, or for that matter, read, go on Twitter, and the war between the people who think that the decisions are right and wrong is just fierce. Facebook too. And it isn't, of course, just that Governor Kelly is wrong, but she's a dictator and a tyrant and a anti-constitutional. The people who were protesting yesterday at Topeka, some of the protesters had guns and camouflage, I mean, so fact-based decision-making has really given way to where we were pre-COVID, in my view.
And I would just make a point to piggyback off that. I can also go back to campaigns. There's a lot of research that when people are anxious, I mean, kind of duh. They seek out information.
Yes.
So anxiety drives people to learn to resolve that anxiety. And we're still seeing right now, at least in national polling, we don't have a lot of good polling of Kansas at the moment, that voters are still, well, not voters, but Americans are still quite anxious about this. It is becoming more partisan. The concerns that people have are also getting more partisan. Democrats more concerned about health, Republicans more concerned about the economy in some of the more recent polling. But people still seem anxious. They still seem engaged with the situation. Self-reported attention to news is still up. And I think that could also have implications for some of the campaign points that we were talking about earlier and reaching voters. I think for me, one of the unanswered questions is, are voters going to choose to pay more attention to the campaign this year because they are concerned, they're more anxious than normal? And what effect does that have on something like social media, for example? Typically, research will tell you social media is an incredibly ineffective way of campaigning. It speaks to the base, but it doesn't typically get to swing voters. But maybe this year it is the year it actually is an effective way to reach voters if we as voters choose to tune in more. And I think that entire voter side of the psychology of the campaign, there are a lot of unanswered questions that we'll just have to see as the campaign progresses.
No question about that. My own view is that you're exactly right. The vast majority of Americans are still interested in the immediate anxiety relieving information and really don't look at it through a political lens at all. And those folks are sort of, coming to grips with whatever the world looks like now. And they will, when November gets here, reach a decision. Am I still anxious? And if so, do I blame the president or do I blame the incumbents? Or am I reasonably comfortable with the steps that have been taken, and therefore I will reelect those? That's the decision they'll make. The partisans are going to partisan. I mean, that's the left and the right are just going to fight because that's what they do. And they're doing it now, and they will continue that sort of low-level hum, in my view, right up to Election Day. But Dr. Miller, they're not persuadable at all. I mean, the folks that are, supporting the president now aren't going to, the hardcore supporters or opposing, but support him, are not going to wake up, October 31st and go, you know what, I'm changing my mind. No, that's been decided, and this is a sport, really.
Right.
It's the vast majority of Americans who do have, contemporary concerns who will reach a decision. And my guess is late, mid-October, late October, and say, do I want 4 more years of this guy or do I want something new? And that'll be the central dynamic of the campaign.
Yeah. And I think another interesting thing with that is, at least at the presidential level, one thing that we know about the true swing voters out there, and they do exist, even if they're only maybe 10% of the electorate at best, is they often tend to make their decisions more based on personality,
yes,
intangibles, rather than issues.
Yes. Am I comfortable with this guy?
Yeah. So this is the kind of voter who in 2016 really wouldn't have thought too much probably about, do I agree more with Clinton or Trump? It's, who do I like more? Who's more likable? Who's going to change the system more and just be different? And I think that will be an interesting voter to watch this year. Do they think more about issues than they typically are in the past? But also, how has the last 4 years changed their perception of Trump? And also, how does the campaign create or change their perception of Biden? So that would be another interesting thing to watch.
Awesome. Well, I have one more question for you guys. So surely this pandemic will change the healthcare debate going forward. How does it change it?
Oh boy. I would say that right now, looking at national polling, you're not seeing huge changes in what people are thinking. The question of like single payer healthcare and so forth, which is an incredibly difficult thing to poll on. I mean, let me just say that. People have all kinds of competing considerations about healthcare. They want people to have healthcare. They like the idea of universal access. You can even get them in surveys to agree that the government should pay for it, but tell them it's going to raise taxes and they back off, or tell them that it might lead to some kind of waits or some other threat to their healthcare access, and they get very, very skittish. So people are very malleable when it comes to healthcare policy. They're very non-committal. The left and the right will both trumpet these polls that say, look, the public wants what we want. But I think you have in reality a public that's very fluid. And thinking about how this crisis is really going to change their base considerations, I think is a very difficult thing to do right now, especially when people are perhaps more concerned about just their everyday lives and navigating that. But I'll punt on that and say, let's look at that in 6 months or a year to see if some of the fundamental considerations that people have about healthcare access and the role of government in that change.
Yeah, I would say a couple things. First, I do think that the crisis as it continues will expose the cracks in the healthcare system, particularly for the unemployed, the newly unemployed, of which there are millions. We've already seen that, by the way, with the unemployment insurance programs in Kansas and other places, which simply aren't equipped to deal with this kind of onslaught of cases. And I do think you will see stories start to surface of people who lost their health insurance when they got laid off from the restaurant or the grocery store or whatever, not grocery store, but retail store, and were unable to get, health care. And that there will be a discussion of trying to cover those folks with some form of public insurance, either Medicaid, Medicare, or something. So I think at the margins that will be a discussion point this fall. Also, and this is a longer term thing, but one of the things people said about single payer repeatedly, even in the Democratic Party, even from Joe Biden, when Bernie Sanders would mention it, is, well, how are you going to pay for it? How are you going to pay for single payer? That's $1 trillion over 10 years. That's an enormous amount of money. We can't afford it. We spent $3 trillion in the last 3 weeks federally. I mean, so the idea of, we need to be worried about the deficit and debt and all that other stuff, it's just about as off the table as you can get it in the current environment. And so I do think that will embolden the single payer people who will say, well, or the public option people, which Joe Biden is one of, to say, well, look, I know it's going to cost $200 billion. That's peanuts compared to what we spent in a 3-week period. And so that discussion has changed, in my view, fundamentally. If you want to spend the money, America, you will spend it, whether you have it in the bank or not, at least at the federal level. States are in a much more difficult situation than the feds. So I think that changes. But Dr. Miller is exactly right that a formal sit down, let's talk about single payer now at Washington is really not going to be on the table. The next 2 years will be an effort to get out of the mess that this disaster has created fiscally and programmatically. I mean, the changes that are coming to our country are just profound. I mean, you can't pick up a paper, which, by the way, I urge all of you to do and to pay for it. But retail stores, extension level event, maybe newspapers, education. We've talked about that, not just post-secondary, but K through 12. A lot of the institutions of our state and our country have been stressed in a way they've never been stressed before. And legislators are going to have to work their way through that before they can get to anything like single payer in my view.
Yeah, it's very interesting, even looking at Democrats, where, it's all fine and good, for example, when, you pose something like Medicare for all in front of Democrats, and they're like, yeah, we're for that. But then change that question a little bit and point out that Medicare for all means getting rid of a lot of Obamacare, which Democrats are actually pretty invested in symbolically, because it's Obama's arguably his crowning achievement. And Democrats in polling become a lot more tepid about that because, that's something that they also understand and they're vested in. So I do think it's an overstatement to say that even the left of the political spectrum in the US is coherently behind any one particular policy. both in Congress, where a lot of even very progressive members of Congress are not behind Medicare for all, because again, they've been very invested in Obamacare, and they know the reality of the politics here, that you can legislate on Obamacare, but you're not going to get single payer, you're not going to get Medicare for all through this Congress, and then get it to be upheld in a Supreme Court that's mostly conservative, which that's a whole issue people don't talk about. So that's an interesting debate. And I do think one thing that Dave points out is that, you know, the scope of unemployment here is huge, and a lot of Americans have lost their healthcare access. And how that impact on your life and people you know, I think is going to be an interesting thing to watch. You know, I can think of, you know, a lot of people here in Lawrence who are able to work at home and still have access to their healthcare. Well, a lot of us also have people in our families who have been laid off, who have lost healthcare access. How does that affect us? So again, you know, let's check back in on that in 6 months. But I'll also be the stick in the mud, because I always am. And you can go back and ask my students all the way back to 2005 when I started teaching. We should actually be concerned about the national debt. It is well over $20 trillion now.
Hey, Doctor, I mean, I've been singing that tune for 25 years because the debt is just unsupportable over time. Even if you can borrow at 0%, it's breathtaking. I guess I was just saying, as a political matter, I just chuckle like crazy because the Republicans are still calling Democrats socialists. And I'm going, well, now, wait a minute, you passed $3 trillion of, in essence, paycheck support in various ways, you know, which is arguably a socialist approach. And so I mean, maybe I'd be fascinated to hear your view. Doesn't the debate over deficits change now?
Well, I mean, I also point out Republicans support their fair share of socialist policies, and
yes,
Social Security and Medicare.
By the way, I just got my Medicare card about a week ago, so I'm paying close attention to that debate.
But no, I think that the symbolism a lot. It's interesting to me to watch our political debates, and to me, I separate the symbolism from the substance. Like,
correct,
symbolism of fascism or socialism, they're just talking points. In reality, that has really no implication for policy, because both parties, both ends of the political spectrum in the US, support policies that are socialist, if you want to get down to the definition of what that is. We're not getting rid of Social Security or Medicare, particularly, anytime soon. But, you know, I think that debt is something that has not gotten the attention that it has. I mean, it was a hot topic in the mid-2000s when we were especially concerned about the solvency of Social Security.
Yeah, it was a Tea Party. I mean, the whole Tea Party organizing principle was, because I covered those rallies, you know, we're spending our grandchildren's inheritance, and we're saddling people with debt. And that, you know, was out the window even before coronavirus, I must say. I mean, the president had run a projected $1 trillion, you know, deficit this year. And then we've just added another 3 trillion to it. It just seems like that debate has changed a lot.
Right. I mean, no president has balanced the budget since Bill Clinton. I mean, that's a reality, right? Bush, Obama, Trump have done nothing but add to the national debt. And the left and the right and the center, because the center is not innocent in any of this either, they are always concerned about the debt when it's stuff that the other side wants to spend on, right? So we like, how are you going to pay for Medicare for all, right? Well, you hear that from more conservative people, but then conservatives don't really complain when defense spending, the Iraq or Afghanistan wars, or Bush's tax cuts ballooned up the national debt by trillions of dollars as well. And I think that the reality of that debate is that most Americans don't, and I think some politicians don't actually understand the reality of how the debt works, and the arguments for both why the debt is a good thing and why it is a bad thing. Ask people that, and a lot of them can't explain it. But I think that the sustainability of it and our ability to pay the interest on it and so forth is increasingly going to become a problem. And if we're going to address something like Medicare for all or other big social programs that the left or the right may want, that is a whole looming debate that we have turned a blind eye to for about 15 years that we really can't continue doing.
Well, but I'm interested in your views on this, because do you think that all the spending in the last month will change the nature of the argument into this year's election? It was very clear the Republicans were going to accuse the Democrats of being socialists. I mean, that was everywhere. In every press release you get, Barb Boyer is a socialist and Sharice Davids is a socialist. But after spending $3 trillion in 30 days, it seems like the steam comes out of that argument, and yet you're still seeing it a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think the symbolism of it, again, is very divorced from the substance of it.
Yeah.
We're going to see, fascism, socialism.
You're a communist,
Right, but I will be shocked. I will be utterly shocked if anyone running for president this year tries to have a real informed debate about debt and the national debt. Because I don't think that we're there at this point of being concerned about it. And I think what you've seen in the last month is actually the advantage of the federal government not having to balance the budget, because you can just pull out the credit card and deficit spend when you have an emergency. That is not an entirely bad thing.
Yeah. I guess what I'm asking is, if you see Joe Biden and Donald Trump on a debate stage, and Donald Trump says, as we expect him to say, oh, Joe Biden would bankrupt the country, he wants to do a public auction, whatever. Can't Joe Biden say, wait, you just spent $3 trillion that you didn't have? Does that, will people get that or not? Or will this idea that, Democrats want to bankrupt the country still have some resonance?
He can say it. He can point out that Trump hasn't balanced the budget. He's increased the deficit. The debt's gone up under him even before this. Those are all arguments he can make.
Whether people hear it or not is another question.
Yeah, right. Which are also arguments, at least on the debt level, that you can, pin Biden for on Obama. The deficits actually came down under Obama, particularly after Republicans took over Congress and you had to have this compromise take place. So, Biden is not in a perfect place to, hit Trump on that with no record of his own, I would say. But yeah, I'm sure that you'll hear arguments like that come out to try to counter the socialist label, and the socialist label is still going to be used anyway.
I would say that, just broadly speaking, all of this is kind of a minor point, because ultimately, because of the nature of this crisis, the November election, in my view, is just a referendum on where we are as a country, how the president responded, and whether people want to have 4 more years of this, whatever this is, or if they want to change at the top. And that's what will matter in October. And that's what the election, in my view, will be decided on.
Right. And I agree. And I think that was true even before this.
Yes.
However, where Trump is on that has been a moving target for a long time, right? Earlier this year, we all thought, well, Trump's going to be, no one thought that he would be secure for re-election, I think very few people, like maybe outside of Twitter, thought that he was absolutely doomed, right? It was going to be a competitive election.
Correct.
I think earlier this year, people thought, well, with how the economy was going, that might be something that put a little bit of wind at his back, even if in polling, most voters don't actually credit him for it. He's still in office during that. Today's a very different reality, and not just over the state of the economy, but over voter assessments of how he's handling this crisis, which have soured. But where we're going to be on any of that in 4 months or 6 months, I don't think anyone can tell you. I don't have those magical powers. But
don't you think that a lot of the subtext of the open up the country protesting and calls for opening up are based on a fear that the longer the country remains quasi shut down, the bigger the hit to the economy, and therefore the bigger the hit to his potential re-election chances?
For some people, I think some people take it to the point of the electoral consequences of that.
Right.
Just like, early on, I could point out people I know on social media saying that a month ago that COVID-19 wasn't real and it was a hoax that
Yeah.
liberals made up to take Trump.
Yes. No, I think that's an important point. I think, people have been blaming the president for being slow to respond, and all that is right, but everyone was slow to respond. I mean, nobody thought this would happen. Nobody.
But I think my point is that, yes, there are always going to be those people at any point along the story or the debate who are going to take it to the level of the electoral consequence.
Yep.
I'm not convinced that's where most people are right now. I mean, I think a lot of Americans are very concerned about the economy and concerned about health and concerned about, families not having enough to eat. And you look at the demand for food. From soup kitchens and food kitchens and so forth, Just Food here in Lawrence, and other organizations like that. Demand is sky high. People are out of work. People are not able to pay rent. Like, that's a huge and immediate impact to people that's also weighing against their desire to stay healthy. But I don't think most Americans are then jumping to the next level and saying, well, what's the electoral calculus of this?
No, they're not doing that now. But if it's October 15th and they're still out of work and they still don't have health insurance.
Well, right.
Then
They will, because that choice is becoming very clear to them. I guess my point is that people are going to have to make those decisions for themselves, and that's going to shape how they vote and perceive the situation. I just don't think most people today are saying, well, what's the impact going to be in 6 months? And that's going to dictate how I feel and what I say today about it.
No, I agree with that. Although I do think activists are worried that President Trump's biggest argument was a healthy economy. And there was no denying that it was, robust in terms of employment. At least growth wasn't where it needed to be. But by and large, that was the biggest or biggest argument that the president had. And the longer the shutdown goes on, the tougher it is going to be for him to make that argument in November. And I do think some supporters see a political subtext to what's going on.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, but activists are not
political
activists, left or right or center, are not typical Americans.
That's a good reminder for political reporters every once in a while too.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. Those are all the questions I have for today. I appreciate your cooperation throughout everything, and I learned a lot. You guys have a lot of great insight. So thank you. I want to thank our guests today for tuning in to our first virtual PNP, and everyone at the Dole Institute as well for their help in organizing this program. We'll have our next virtual Pizza and Politics next Friday, May 1st, same time, same place. And we're going to be sitting down with Joey Hensler, who ran for the 2019 Lawrence City Commission. And we're going to talk about what it takes to run in an election. So for those of you tuning in, hopefully you can join us next week. But thank you both again. So I really appreciate it, and
Pleasure.
Hope everyone is staying safe.
Thank you. Good luck writing a paper for my class.
I will, yeah.